For Sunday, June 17th, you've found the Georgia gang. Topping our agenda today, how much damage to Casey Cagle in the governor's race? Could Atlanta be home to the World Cup? And at Port of Savannah, the dredging will continue. Some of the stories up for grabs on the Georgia gang.
From the Fox 5 studios, the Georgia gang starts now.
And we're glad you could be with us on this Sunday. Last week, we had just gotten word, really, of the Clay Tippins recording of Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle, and we discussed Tippins's discourtesy in revealing the tape, but we didn't really discuss the political fallout because there wasn't any at that point. But I'm wondering, and I'll start with you, Theron, is Casey Cagle damaged by these recordings, by the recording by Clay Tippins, and then the interview with his uncle Lindsey Tippins, in which they called Casey Cagle dishonest and politically driven and not concerned about the substance of the bills that he passes?
Well, this is one of the things that happens in a runoff, because as you have more and more time to dig up information to use against your opponent and to figure out how to earn media around it, that's the risk of being the person who was a top vote getter. So is he damaged? Yes. I think that it definitely distracted his campaign at a time where he was spending about $1.2 million on, as he liked to call, comparison and contrast ads against Kemp, but it was really more so an attack ad. You know, to sit down with someone for 90 minutes and to have that conversation recorded, I mean, you can discuss a whole lot of things. And so I think the Cagle campaign is trying to respond to it as best they can, but it definitely was a tough week for them, and they've got to figure out a way to regroup.
Phil, here's the problem I have with it from the get-go. Republicans generally favor charter schools. That was one of the bills in question, funding for students in charter schools. The second one is the Georgia Gold Scholarship Program, very popular, helped an awful lot of people. Why should Cagle be on the defensive about either of those bills?
Well, that's right. And just to kind of set the stage for the viewers, this was what was said on this surreptitious audio recording. Cagle said that he really thought this was a very bad bill with regard to the scholarships for private schools, but then he said, I passed it anyway. That was the crux of what we're talking about today. And so you're absolutely right. I think that surveys have shown throughout the years that not just conservatives, but a lot of Democrats and a lot of independents appreciate parental choice charter schools. And so if you're a true conservative or even just somebody that's interested in good education, you would be for choice. So I think that Cagle, to your point, he got off message. This has been a bad week for him.
Now, Kathy, you might have a totally different take, because you don't really have a dog in the fight. You probably don't care about either of those bills, do you?
Whoa, I do. I disagree. Phil and I are just going to disagree all the time. I disagree that these, I'm going to call them voucher bills, because you're transferring taxpayer dollars to private schools. $100 million direct transfer, I disagree with. Everybody doesn't have access to those schools, and that money could be used to help our public education system. And, you know, we want to talk about how we're a business-friendly state, but we don't have a workforce that's ready to fill the kinds of jobs that are coming here. And so I disagree with that. I also think Cagle has completely lost control of the message. Phil, you just said that. You know, the damage is that he can't control his own story. And I think he's hurt by this. And I think as the first place person in the runoff, he's already challenged because everybody else is looking for somebody else.
And then comes the New York Times, and our old friend Kevin Sack, who worked with me at the AJC, with a story that Cagle may have taken advantage of a lobbyist's favor to purchase a condominium downtown. It looked like a real estate story to me, not a political scandal story, because in the recession, what was the true valuation of any condo in Atlanta? The market collapsed. Do you think that story has legs, anyone?
I don't think it has legs, but I think that he's, again, lost control of the messaging, and he's got about, 4 weeks to get it back. And if more stuff just keeps coming out that he has to be kind of set back on his heels, he's not going to be able to tell a story about why voters should prefer him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do think as a registered lobbyist, you have to be as pure as Caesar's wife when it comes to these transactions with a very powerful state official, where you're having bills that come through that chamber where the official presides over the chamber. That's the optics.
Well, but I don't know. The prices were sort of murky, and
I don't disagree with your real estate analysis, but I'm just talking about the political optics.
All right, but in the meantime, Brian Kemp is kind of quiet. He's on the receiving end of attack commercials that Theron referred to, where he is called untrustworthy and incompetent over a business deal he had. I get the impression that it might be good that Brian Kemp doesn't have a lot of money for this runoff, because it's all about Cagle now, as you mentioned, Kathy. It's really not about Brian Kemp. I sense that that's a good posture for him. What do you think?
Well, what's interesting is that, we're in this sort of 30-plus county. I know we probably have about 60-plus counties that watch this show. But what we don't know is the effect that the negative ads are having outside of the metro area. So I would assume that down in southeast and southwest Georgia, folks are not really paying too close of attention to what we're seeing a lot in the Atlanta media. I think in those media markets, Cagle is dominating because he made such a big buy. And so while Kemp probably is figuring out how to earn media through some of the Cagle challenges that he's having, what we don't know, Dick, is that how it's really affecting the campaigns down in the southern parts and other parts of Georgia. But I do think that Kemp, because we just focus a lot of time on Cagle, I think Kemp has got to figure out a way to drive up a lot of the voters, as Kathy has mentioned, that didn't clearly vote for Cagle. How does he build a right coalition to compete with the amount of money that Cagle is going to have and the built-in infrastructure of voters that he has around the state? I think therein lies the challenge for Kemp, because while Cagle is floundering this week, he's got an experienced team of people working with him, and he's going to have better weeks to come.
Well, I agree with you, Theron, on the rural vote. And of course, it's all turnout, as we talk about every week when it comes to especially a runoff that's going to be very low turnout. Dick, I'm a little surprised. Money is the mother's milk of politics. Kemp, every candidate needs money, especially, as you point out, to turn out the vote. So I think maybe, I don't know, but maybe this is helping Brian Kemp's fundraising with all of this negativity toward Cagle. But yes, Cagle has a lot of money. There's still time for him to bounce back. There's still time to do attack ads. Yeah. And so at this point, it's very hard to say what's going to happen in the runoff.
In the meantime, on the Democratic side, I noticed something interesting this week, Kathy. The Democratic nominee, Stacey Abrams, has declared herself the public education governor, just as you did just a moment ago. It's the same tactic. Of course, ignoring the fact that money that doesn't go to public schools gives the public schools more to spend per pupil. That's a fact that's often omitted. But I wonder if a public education governor is the right tack, or is she just trying to, at the moment, separate herself from Casey Cagle?
Oh, I think it's the right tact. I mean, public education is the key to our democracy, and I think that to the extent that we're defunding it. No, public education is free education for everyone, where people can get a good education.
Even in schools that are failing, you still want to fund them?
Yes.
And parents and students are trapped in a failing school, and there's no choice.
Well, the choice should be different public schools. Different publicly funded schools.
There's state-sponsored charter schools. And one of the bills in question with Casey Cagle and his conversation with Lindsey Tippins was how much money the students get in those public charter schools.
But I think this was an excellent move by the Abrams campaign, because we have 1.8 million students in Georgia that are in public education, right? And so at a time where the governor finally, did the right thing and fully funded QBE and fully funded education, she's now taking that issue off the table and she wants to own it. And I agree with Kathy, is that whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, you all want to find a way to fully fund public education, because it's a way to get this education that we need for a more well-trained workforce. And so I think this was a good move by the Abrams campaign. I think education is going to be the center of the November election once the nominee is selected on the Republican side.
We've got to get out, but I hear the three of you saying that you think this Republican runoff is very unsettled, and that the damage isn't measurable yet to Cagle.
It is. Remember, it's July 24th, so that's a lifetime in politics.
And early voting starts in early July, and so Cagle and Kemp are going to try to bank as many early votes as they can.
All right. When we come back, we will talk about happy stuff, namely the World Cup. Could it be right here in Mercedes-Benz Stadium? Stay with us.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Visit their website at fox5atlanta.com.
Atlanta's always been the city that can, and this week we saw further evidence of it. The corrupt body that governs world soccer, nothing else to call them but corrupt, wisely voted to award the World Cup in 2026 to Canada, Mexico, and the United States, with most of the games being played in the United States. And Atlanta seems to have the track to host a semifinal of the World Cup in 2026, mainly because of the stadium, air, hotels. It's what we do. We have national championships. We have the Final Four coming up. We have the Super Bowl coming up. We just keep doing it. Is there a negative thing to be said about World Cup soccer? Especially given the Atlanta United success, huh?
Yeah.
Well, no, and you're making a good point. And we won't know for a couple years if Atlanta could be the host city. We all certainly hope it can be and will be. But I think it's a great thing.
Well, you had the continuation of what happened under previous administrations, and so Mayor Campbell, Mayor Franklin, Mayor Reed all sort of continued this push to making Atlanta.
Andy Young in the Olympics.
Hold on, I'm getting there.
Okay.
I said continue, but it really started with Maynard Jackson and Andy Young. I had the pleasure of looking at the Maynard Jackson documentary on the plane, and so they started it, but those three mayors have continued it. So now Mayor Bottoms, you see, is really teaming up with her partners on the state and the local
and
level.
don't forget the private sector too,
Well,
because you got Arthur Blank and the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, and
this was the vision of them, and so that's why I hope that we keep that in mind when we are putting out a lot of negative rhetoric that could, will enter itself in these elections. That you don't forget that we got an opportunity to host the World Cup.
You gave me a transition there. You mentioned Mayor Bottoms. Kathy, you ran for that job, and you lost to the eventual mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms. And it occurred to me this week, it's not easy being Keisha Lance Bottoms following Kasim Reed. It might have been different if Kasim had just left office and she became the mayor. But there's been so much news about the Reed administration that Bottoms is in the position of having to react to it all. This week, she appointed Roosevelt Council, who was the interim airport director, appointed him to be the city's CFO. I wondered if maybe a fresh face wasn't needed in both jobs. Not that I have anything against Roosevelt Council.
I think, again, we've sort of talked about this. I think she would do well to bring in new people that are her people, that are loyal to her, and that present to Atlantans, a real fresh face about Atlanta government. And, Roosevelt's not a bad guy. I just think, when you're really trying to say, look, I'm different, I'm my own person, and here's who I've touched, and they're the best there is out there, then I think you're really selling people something
Well, the bottom line
convincing.
is Roosevelt Council has been very controversial. There's obviously a federal investigation going looking at corruption. But let me make a point. Let me make a point. His deputy airport manager, Cortez Carter, actually his wife was tied to a big vendor at the airport. That's disgraceful in itself. I agree with you. There should be a new fresh face there.
Let me jump in here because I know Roosevelt Council personally, and I know Kathy does as well. And if you look at his job as being a deputy CFO and then stepping in temporarily to be CFO and then going back to the airport as a deputy CFO and then being promoted to interim general manager of the world's busiest and most efficient airport. To me, I think it was a great thing because the mayor wanted someone in that CFO position that is trusted, that knows how the budget works, and he did a good job as being the interim.
But then he got called off on that ethics problem with Cortez Carter.
So what we can't,
you don't want to talk about that.
No, that was, you can't control what your employees do. All right, and when Roosevelt did, when Cortez and his wife stuff came up, Roosevelt stepped away and let this independent investigation conclude. So I don't want us to get on this show and criticize Mayor Bottoms, because I would tell you, stay tuned. As we tape next week, or maybe the week after, you're going to see this new direction. You're going to see more and more people coming into her administration. So I do think she's distancing herself from the former administration. I think she's going in the right direction.
Staying in the same category, it's not easy to be Keisha Lance Bottoms. It was revealed this week. Again, she's having to react.
Yeah,
it was revealed this week that under Kasim Reed in his last year, the city spent $50 million in overtime, busted its budget entirely. When you were president of City Council, you would have gone ballistic over news like that.
Yeah, and and I really think we need to take a long, hard look at the last City Council, especially in the last quarter of this term, because everything that gets raised, they passed on. And I don't get how in an election year you let stuff like that get by.
They don't approve overtime. You mean there's not much in the budget?
But they're tracking the budget. You know, all these issues that have come up, they should have been on top of. And I hope that that's a lesson to the new council, that they really need to say no when they need to say no. And you know, Shirley and I had, you know, a relationship that was respectful. I never thought that it was my job to let her do anything she wanted to do. I didn't think it was my job to stop her from being successful. But I think that there's a balance there, and I think the council needs to get some gumption and step up.
But the other thing is more importantly, it's about recruitment, right? And so you had these officers who were working overtime, and so what the mayor and the council have got to figure out is how do we retain our good, hardworking officers, the men and women who protect us every day, but then how do we recruit new officers so we don't have to pay? How do we don't have to pay additional?
I'm not sure her plan for a $1,000 bonus is the answer.
No, and we're losing more cops. I talk to cops a lot. I'm sure you do too, and we're losing more.
I don't really talk that many cops.
Well, you should. But anyhow, you hit it, and I think that City Council again, I agree with you, needs to step up.
But the $1,000 payment, Dick, is a good faith estimate. I think that there's going to be possibly a 3% raise in the proposed budget by the mayor. So the $1,000 to these officers show that she's making a good faith estimate to pay them the money that deserve to be paid.
Okay, we're not going to have time to get to the other sort of weird story of the week, where the investigation into the mysterious $40,000 payment from the nonprofit group to the city to pay back Kasim Reed's expenses on a trip to South Africa is stalled because the lawyers wanted $1,200 an hour. Wow.
For $1,200 flat, I'll investigate it.
I'd be happy to investigate. There you go.
But they brought in a new firm, and the firm is going to finish the job at a much lower cost.
Now you're in favor of new people coming in. Okay. That's good.
All right, when we come back, the Port of Savannah, how the Georgia voter rolls might be affected by the Supreme Court, some other things. Stay with us.
Have a question or comment for the Georgia Gang? Visit their website at fox5atlanta.com.
You know, sometimes on the Georgia Gang, we get down to the weeds of little political items and we forget bigger picture items, but we're not doing that today because we mentioned World Cup soccer and now the Port of Savannah, and it looks to me like the big federal contribution that seemed to have been stalled and that Donald Trump didn't seem to be interested in has now been fixed in the sense that Congress has appropriated a bunch more money for the dredging, for the deeper Port of Savannah. And Phil, my sense is David Perdue was key to this.
Well, I think you're right. Senator Perdue is a key player. He's close to the president. The president, we always talk about, rightly so, the economic benefits of the dredging and the expansion of the port in Savannah. But it's also a national security issue, and that also gets the president's attention. So, and I have to say, this was all of the Georgia delegation, Democrat and Republicans, had been stressing for years the importance of funding.
True.
And so everybody really does deserve on the congressional delegation congratulations.
And it's just a couple of years away, apparently, when these deeper ships that can hold more cargo containers will come. And there's the spin-off of that across the whole state is just immense. I think people understand that. But talk a little bit about voting rights. A bunch of cases are starting to either be resolved at the Supreme Court level or about to approach it. And this past week, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Ohio could purge its voter rolls for people who hadn't voted in, I think it's 4 years in Ohio. And Georgia, Brian Kemp, the Secretary of State, has tried to do the same thing here. Tremendous resistance from Democrats about any purging of the voter rolls, but the Supreme Court didn't seem to have any trouble with it. The one that's going to affect Georgia is these two little House districts, one in Henry County, one in Gwinnett, that the Republicans redistricted in 2015. And this week, a federal court sort of dismissed that, as I understand it, on the grounds the Supreme Court is going to rule on it at some point.
Well, there's two, these are two issues.
The general principle.
These are two issues. The bottom line on your first issue with regard to the Supreme Court ruling is that the Common Cause and the NAACP withdrew their lawsuit against the state of Georgia because now it's settled. Secondly, now, that's very interesting. Another Supreme Court ruling, we're hoping for will determine what is political gerrymandering. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever side you're looking at, partisan-wise, you know, a lot of Republicans are white and a lot of Democrats are black, and that's kind of the conundrum that the court has to deal with when you're doing gerrymandering with those two Georgia districts you're talking about.
Well, and let me just further explain that. In general terms, over our nation's history, the Supreme Court has said that partisan gerrymandering is not unconstitutional. Racial gerrymandering would be. The problem is when you have 90% of African Americans voting Democratic, partisan becomes racial. So that seems to be the issue in Georgia. Is that how you read it?
Well, there's also another issue, and it's been focused on Georgia's 12th congressional district. So Eric Holder's leading a group that filed a lawsuit against Georgia, basically saying that when they had an opportunity to redraw the congressional districts, they took out a Savannah, which we know Chatham County is a very mixed county, but it has a Democratic stronghold. And so I think I disagree a little bit, Dick, because I think the people who live in certain areas of this state should be represented by people who look like them and who are of that area. And so when so when you are strategically, for partisan reasons, cutting out Democratic counties because they have African American votes or people of color to benefit Republicans, and then there's even talk about going to a 14th congressional district because of the population growth that we're seeing here in Georgia. I think therein lies some of the legal challenges that you're going to see come to the state.
But more people of color are voting Republican, and you can see that in some of the numbers in recent cycles. So that kind of undercuts your argument.
I mean, just because of Republicans, y'all so happy because you get a 3% to 4% increase of African Americans and people of color voting for you. That's not a significant increase. I think what I'm trying to say is that the maps in the congressional districts and these House districts should reflect the population growth and the demographic changes, but don't cut out certain portions because you want to benefit the
Dick,
Republican
I have
Party.
to laugh because it wasn't so long ago when Roy Barnes and Bobby Kahn were in control of the state when he was governor.
20 years ago.
And they were doing the worst gerrymandering possible, and of course the Democrats loved it back then. So it's rank hypocrisy.
Well, and they're the only ones, that administration, Democrats, are the only ones that had their lines struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. You've dealt with this for a long time.
Well, I think those two districts you talked about that Joyce Chandler represents and Brian Strickland used to represent, those have been gerrymandered more than once.
Correct.
On subsequent elections, they have pulled out and put in different people to hold on to those seats. And
every time the demography changes.
Yeah, and
But that's partisan.
I don't care what it is. I think people expect that when we gerrymander or design our districts every 10 years, that it holds for 10 years. I mean, minimally, if we could get
That's
that.
true. The Republicans did do that in the middle of a decade.
Yeah,
That's right.
twice.
People move around now. It's a mobile society. And both parties have done this
Well, I wouldn't
during
go
the
there,
10-year
Phil.
period.
Then change the law that says when you're going to redistrict.
Okay.
All right, we got to get out. When we come back, how about anointing some winners and some losers? We'll be right back.
Time now for the week's winners and losers.
And don't forget us, as always, on Facebook and on YouTube, where we have the Georgia Gang channel. You on your phone, or are you looking at notes?
Notes, but let Phil go first.
Phil go first? Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Go.
Well, I got a winner, and that is the new president of Kennesaw State University. And she's a Georgia Bulldog, by the way. She's coming from the University of Georgia, Pamela Whitten. And then my loser is the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Stacey Abrams. You had to shake your head this past week when it comes out that, she owes the federal government $54,000 in taxes and hasn't paid it, and yet she's donating $50,000 to her own campaign. Come on.
She's trying to win.
I'd pay the tax man first. The Crossbar Hotel is not an inviting place.
There's nothing wrong with putting something on it. That's what a lot of people do.
All right.
So a few winners. AT&T and the Time Warner merger complete. That's a big winner. Also want to recognize Rhonda Briggins, who left MARTA, longtime employee there. She's joined Jacobs. Also a shameless plug. I had the opportunity to welcome Kenyatta Mitchell to my firm, Paramount Consulting Group. So she's a wonderful lobbyist who's joined a lot of experience in waste management and government affairs and lobbying. And then my last winner is going to be Senator Johnny Isakson for stepping up this week and calling President Trump out on some of his bogus tariffs claims and his waffling on whether he's for free trade or not really for free trade. And so I definitely want to make him a winner.
Well, he and David Perdue are on different sides of that argument. Kathy, what do you have?
Winner, Theron, you're the winner. You got Kenyatta Mitchell on your team. She is great. I'm excited for you and for her. I'm rooting for Iceland. in the World Cup. And I mean, and so I think Iceland's a big winner. They got there. You know, they got about 6 people, you know, on the island, and they're all playing soccer. So it's good. I'm there for that. Losers, I think Atlanta taxpayers just keep being the losers, right? This overtime stuff, it isn't this mayor's fault, but you know, the tally gets higher, and I think we have to pay very close attention to how this $2 billion in MARTA money is going to get spent. MARTA's citizen engagement process basically is we're going to show up at some festivals, y'all come over to our booth and tell us what you like, and no data to accompany those decisions. So I think Atlanta taxpayers have just got to get up and roar and start minding the store a little better.
All right, down in Macon, great former Major League pitcher Kevin Brown, who pitched for the Yankees among other teams, just happened to be looking for somebody who was stealing mail in the neighborhood and took his gun out and kept watch and caught him. You know, that's a fastball. That's a good one, high, hard, and over the plate. And Julio Jones, a little bit of concern here. He's not showing up for the Falcons' preseason activities, but as the promo on Fox says, long, hot, fun summer, meaning the Braves and Atlanta United, they're both in first place. That's startling. See you next week on the Georgia Gang.
The opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the panelists appearing in this program.